first one.
You like the first one?
Yeah, it's like kind of like I like the like flow and like structure.
Yeah. That's really cool. That's like his opus 1, so it's really cool to me that was like his first piece. Started off strong.
I like the first one. Thank you. Pleasure.
You like the Chausson? Yeah, that's a really good one. Yeah, that's my mom's favorite. She was the one who convinced me to play it on the program. Yeah, she's got pretty good taste. I think. Yeah. Anybody, any other favorite pieces?
What was
The last one? Not the encore, but the Schubert. Yeah, that was fun. That was fun.
I had a story.
What's that?
The story was captivating.
Oh yeah. You guys should read it. Ivan Turgenev is the writer. Song of Triumphant Love is the name of the story. If you read the story and then immediately you hear the piece, it will change how you hear it. I promise. Because this has been one of my favorite pieces since I was probably 12 or 13, and I knew it for years before I discovered the story. And then I heard the story and I was like, oh, now it makes so much sense. So if you guys have the time to check it out, it's not too long of a read. Yeah, it's really a short story. So yeah, but glad you guys enjoyed it. Yeah, you have a question?
Is it like meant for like to like bumpy kind of?
Kinda. It's very like scenic. I feel like I was able to imagine like a very clear picture of the scene, of the kind of surroundings. It takes a little while for the kind of action to start, because like I said, the guy goes away for 5 years before he comes back, and then the Song of Triumph and Love makes an appearance. Yeah, it's a little bit of a love triangle, and there's obviously some like magic and sort of supernatural stuff involved, because there's something just so like haunting about this melody. I always loved it, but in the context of the story, it really is a very meaningful moment in the music. Yeah, do you have a question?
How long do you practice
Per day. These days, I'd say probably average like 2 hours. I wish I could practice more. When I was in high school, probably between 4 or 5 hours. Yeah, but that was, preparing for auditions. You have to prepare like 2 hours of music for 15-minute auditions. It's a little stressful. So, yeah. But practice is the best way to me to get around like nerves. Because if I'm really prepared, no matter how like physically nervous I am, I can trust that okay, I've done this a million times. I've practiced it. So yeah, but nowadays I travel quite a lot, so it's tough sometimes to find time consistently. But who knows? Maybe one day I'll get back to 4 hours. Yeah.
How do you like manage and allocate your time on like pieces and like certain moments that are difficult and like scales and technicals, and how do you like kind of like practice? Like, how do you like, which sets apart like practice and rehearsal with your pianist?
That's an interesting question. Rehearsals with Zhu are we don't say much, actually. I think a lot of the time, we've been playing together for 5 or 6 years now, so we have a really good kind of sense for each other without having to book or talk too much about things. So, if you play through something and then there's a spot that it seems like we're listening a little bit differently, we just do it again. And we're kind of like, okay, maybe it could be a little bit more, and we always try to, like our way in is character and is like the mood. So if we want something, rather than saying, well, I think it should be faster, I think it should be slower, we always try to associate it with something that's more along the lines of like, oh, I think this can be more exciting, or maybe this can be more tired, or something like that. So to me, that brings the music to life so much more than saying, okay, let's play it faster, slower, louder, softer. Those are pretty, actually not very meaningful instructions, right, when it comes to like trying to tell a story with the music. But as far as dividing my time in practice, I would say, oh yes.
No, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just answering a question about our rehearsal process, and I was saying we don't say much because we just sort of, if something goes weird, then we just play it again and listen a little bit, differently, a little bit more closely. But I don't know. Maybe I would be curious to hear your answer for this, because you asked how you divide your practice time.
Yeah.
between different pieces and certain sections of different pieces. So for me, we all know as players which sections are a little bit more difficult. So I like to start with those. Like sometimes I'll warm up like with something out of like Tchaikovsky concerto, just to make sure I can still play it, but also to give myself the chance to sort of, a lot of my practice of the 2 hours that I do on average is very slow. I rarely practice things in tempo, unless I'm getting pretty close to a performance, because to me I need as much time as possible to figure out, all the little details of how one note moves into the next one and how this bow stroke really works without me trying to sort of force it. So it's a little bit different every day as far as what parts of the music I practice, but always try to make sure that I play the parts that are a little uncomfortable and a little more challenging. And when I get frustrated, that's when I play the parts that are a little easier, because it makes me feel better about myself. But yeah, I don't know. What's your sort of, do you have a system?
I don't. I mean, I like to also start with something that is a little bit difficult technically, and but I like to keep in mind that I need to take breaks in between the segments. Sometimes I get into this get frustrated and I keep walking and keep walking. Then once you hit one point, then you realize it's actually not improving. So sometimes I like to take a 10 minutes break after half an hour, 40 minutes, and just to clear my mind, and not really leaving too far from practice room and instrument, but just to take some deep breaths and come back to it in 10 minutes or something.
That's really important.
So it's like a step back and kind of like see the entire picture and then like kind of zoom in.
Yeah, exactly. Because at that moment when you practice, it's like you're so zoomed in, like you said. But if you take a breath, you might gonna see it from a different perspective that might solve the problem in a more effective way. So I strongly recommend that.
Yeah, gotta take breaks. People hear like, I practice 4 hours a day, and they think you practice 4 hours straight. Especially if it's like a weekend, you can start practicing at like 10 a.m. and finish at 6. Because you take 1 hour and then you go do something else, then 1 hour and you go do something else. For me, when I was younger, it was like 50 minutes was my practice time, and then I'd take a 10-minute break. Now, as I'm getting older, I agree I need more breaks. So I'll do 30 minutes or 40 minutes and then take a little break. And like you said, when you're frustrated, that it's really hard to stay subjective with the music. You're frustrated and you start to feel like, okay, I want to do it this way, this way, this way, and you lose the sense that you actually have some freedom in how it is that you want to play this sort of difficult passage. So, yeah, that was a good question. Thank you. Any other ones? Yeah.
How much time do you spend on like fundamentals, like such as scales and arpeggios?
When I was in in my heyday of practice time, when I was kind of before I went to college, 1 hour. 1 hour a day for scales. When I was even younger, I would do 1 hour scales, 1 hour etude, and then 1 or 2 hours of repertoire. Because especially when you're young and you're still sort of figuring out your kind of relationship to the instrument physically, the scales and the etudes will translate to every piece that you play. Whereas if you spend 2 hours on a piece of repertoire, you might get that, you might get it pretty quickly, but it's not always so clear and so easy to translate what you work on in a particular piece to a different piece. But I think scales and etudes and technique are universally applicable. So I would definitely advise at least 1 hour for that kind of stuff, depending on how much time you guys have in a given day to practice. But that's my thought. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, you should you can also just to assess yourself. You don't have to necessarily set a very strict kind of brand of how much you do this and how much you do that, and you can allow yourself to be more free in terms of how you do it. I mean with structure, but not necessarily you have to really get into the teeth of how you have to do this and do that. I mean, at least for me now, it's like it depends on what I need to do, long term, short term. And it's just so you really have to always kind of go back and think about what you want to do because you always change. You have your option and your goal is always changing. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. Even still today, first notes that I play when I pick up the violin for the first time on any given day is a scale. And usually I have a piece in mind that I want to start with, so I'll just play the scale that's the same key as that piece. So I kind of have that tonal world in my ears. Yeah, but I think one of the things I took a long time to figure out about practicing scales and etudes, try to make it pretty. Try to make it beautiful and musical. Right? Everybody gets so caught up in like playing every note in tune and making a really clean sound. But for me, there's no moment ever in music where there's not like some kind of shape or color or direction that you want to give it. So as much as you can infuse that into your practice, whether it's repertoire or whether it's technique, I would encourage that, right? Sometimes I'll like try to, because it's a little bit backwards, I'll try to like play scales crescendoing through to the tip. And then on the way back, I'll try to decrescendo to the frog. Something that's shaped and not exactly what's comfortable, so that when it comes to playing repertoire, you know if you need to do that, you have it.
So not robotic.
Exactly, the opposite of robotic.
Okay.
Right? I don't know any genre of music, but especially classical. I don't know one piece. I don't know one player. Well, maybe I know a couple players, but I don't know any music that I listen to and I'm like, this should be played really straight in time, no creativity. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, what you see on the page are just suggestions from the composer. You know what I mean? So I think when you have that ability that you develop in your own practice to do things a little bit differently, just instinctively, I think it becomes much more easy to sort of decode and make music your own. Yeah, so take advantage of that time when you have scales and you know where every note is going to be, right? It's not like learning a piece where you're jumping around all over the place and having to figure out how to kind of shape things. So yeah.
To basically make it yours.
Exactly. Even a scale or an etude, especially etudes. There's some really pretty etudes, but we always practice them like, well. I did too, but it took me a long time to figure out that, a lot of people try to separate technique and musicality. They're like, oh, I want to learn the notes first, and then I'll just sprinkle in some musicality on top. But if you start from the place of like, okay, I don't know this piece, let's figure out what it's about. As you learn the notes and the strokes and all of that stuff, it becomes much more natural when it comes time to perform. Because you practice that sense of freedom into your system from the beginning. Yeah, that's a good question. Any other ones? Someone, did you have one? Okay, yeah, okay. I think you have your hand up?
Yeah. When you're like introducing a new piece, like how do you get like started and like kind of like understand what you should do? Like, oh, I should like put like staccato or like I should like add in like more a bouncy feeling. Like how would you like begin like to understand like the kind of like the just like of it?
It's a good question. I mean, for me, it's been a while since I've learned a new piece. But when I did, I first of all start from the score. When you're playing a piece especially for more than one instrument, violin and orchestra or violin, guitar, cello, and piano, it's important to know what the other part is doing. Because in the same way that you have to kind of practice this musicality into your system, you have to practice and develop this awareness of what's happening in the piece as a whole, right? A lot of times that's what gives me the perspective I need to say, okay, actually my part needs this, because this is happening in the piano part, right? So I would start with either listening to the piece or sitting down and just looking at the score and trying to hear it in your head as clearly as you can. And I'm sure that will answer a lot of questions that you have about what kind of is necessary technically. And then it becomes, okay, I see this happening in the score, what does it mean to me, right? You can listen to recordings or go and hear people play it. But honestly, these days, I feel like when I hear recordings, the thing that I find most valuable, especially when I'm listening to like my favorite artists, and I hear things that they do, and I say, you know what, I don't actually like that. I want to do it this way, right? So as much as you listen to recordings and hear and say, oh, I want to do it like that, pay attention to those moments where you're like, I would do it differently. And ask yourself, why? What would I do? You know, why would I do that differently? That, I think, will start to kind of inform how you dissect and kind of process music for yourself. Yeah. What do you think? Do you have any process for that?
I agree with what you said. It's basically it's an ongoing process. You know, you never say this is a finished product. I guess that's the mindset I would recommend. Is you always go back and then break down and do it again and again.
I
Guys,
see.
can we get a group shot?
Oh, we did?
We did,
Okay.
yeah.
We did. That was the first order of business.
With everybody?
Oh, we have another question, yeah.
One last question.
Like, how do you like start working on a new piece in general? Because like if you get like a really difficult piece for an orchestra or something, how do you like just start working on that?
Very slowly. Like whatever the metronome marking is, cut it in half and practice it like that. I'm serious. That's Mr. Perlman, who I had a chance to study with for several years. That's like the first thing he'll tell you. If you play something for him and it's a tricky passage and it's not quite in sync, he's just like slow practice. Or if it's really fast in rhythms, right? So if it's straight 16s, he would practice it because it forces you to kind of get out of the comfort zone of playing it straight time. So you play it kind of this off-kilter kind of rhythm, and when you do that so many times and then you go back to playing it straight, it feels a lot simpler, right? But generally, whether you're starting a new piece or whether you're preparing it for a concert, slow practice, right? With like an exaggerated sense of all of this musical business that we've been talking about, right? If there's a crescendo, how does the crescendo go from one note to the next note to the next note? You don't have time to process that if you're playing it in tempo. When you slow it down 50% or 75%, sometimes I practice things and my mom, when I was younger, she would be like, what are you playing? And I'm like, what, you don't recognize this? And I play it that slowly that you almost can't really recognize it because you're hearing and you're feeling every single millisecond of each note, right? And there's a time and a place. You know, I'm not suggesting to practice at 25% speed for 4 hours, but you know, build that in to your practice, especially in places where you're not sure how something works or something is particularly difficult. That's, I think, the fastest way, actually, is by slowing it down, taking your time.